So my presentation today is based on some of my long-standing research in Latinx communities, and I'll talk about that term Latinx in a few minutes as compared to, say, Latina or Latino, as well as some of the newer work that I've been doing on a range of language and social justice efforts. So let's jump right into it. I often open my presentations with this kind of a cartoon type representation, which speaks to the ways that ideas about language are often framed as objective facts. So this notion that, you know, if we're making an assessment of language use that has nothing to do with identity, whether it pertains to gender, race, class, or religion, language is a straightforward fact about the world, and correctness is a straightforward fact about the world. And in fact, this kind of an image, which invokes a sort of racialized and gendered position of a teacher, is not entirely, it doesn't stand in contradiction to the large majority of the demographic of US teachers in K through 12 schools. So that that kind of racialized and gendered position that is located in such a way that that students who are positioned as in need of linguistic remediation or linguistic help are often framed as lacking language, regardless of the extent to which their language practices might seem to correspond to standardized practices in whatever language. So in contrast to this kind of representation, we might think with someone like Chicana lesbian feminist Gloria Anzaldúa, who famously said, "If you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin-skin to linguistic identity. I am my language." So for Anzaldúa, there's no such thing as this approach to language that's somehow divorced from identity. And in fact, we might want to pay very careful attention to the way in which, in the post-civil rights era of the United States, racist and discriminatory views have been remapped from biology onto language and culture. And Bonnie Urcioli, Ana Celia Zentea, and other researchers have continually asserted this analysis, where it used to be acceptable to claim that particular populations' skull sizes or other practices, other biological characteristics made them inferior. That's no longer acceptable in mainstream public spaces throughout the United States. However, it is often acceptable to suggest that populations suffer from a so-called culture of poverty, or that they lack academic language or standard language or legitimate language. And so these ideas about language and culture end up serving as profound vehicles for the reproduction of discriminatory views. And part of what I find in my work is that efforts to locate the Hispanic or Latina, Latino, Latinx population are often rooted in or articulated in relation to language. And there's an ongoing effort to figure out what the implications of this rising demographic are. So let me just give you one example of this from a weekend television news show where Tom Brokaw had this to say, and this was in 2019.
A lot of this we don't want to talk about, but the fact is, on the Republican side, a lot of people see the rise of an extraordinary important new constituency in American politics, Hispanics, who will come here and all be Democrats. Also, I hear when I push people a little harder, I don't know whether I want brown grandbabies. I mean, that's also a part of it. It's the intermarriage that is going on and the cultures that are conflicting with each other. I also happen to believe that the Hispanics should work harder at assimilation. That's one of the things I've been saying for a long time. You know, that they ought not to be just codified in their communities, but make sure that all their kids are learning to speak English and that they feel comfortable in the communities. And that's going to take outreach on both sides, frankly.
So you see a range of stereotypes invoked in this kind of representation. On the one hand, this anxiety about a political affiliation, whether this population skews conservative or liberal. You see ideas, or you hear ideas about brownness, which invoke this notion that this Latinx population or Hispanic population is this racial intermediary that's imagined in between whiteness and blackness. Of course, erasing the millions of Afro-Latinx people and erasing the history of the transatlantic slave trade in relation to Latin America, and just sort of framing, imagining this population as brown, erasing indigeneity, and obscuring a complex history in relation to whiteness as well and Europeanness. So we'd want to think about how that notion of brownness, which has often been championed from some perspectives, is actually quite fraught. You then hear Brokaw invoke these ideas about assimilation, and this notion that I also think that assimilation is something that Hispanics should be trying to do. So assimilation is framed as an effort that an individual can enact and can achieve if they would try to do so. And then language is positioned as a straightforward, so in that respect, assimilation has nothing to do with a whole range of structural experiences, and assimilation frames Americanness in really narrow terms and frames an imagined non-Americanness or a certain kind of foreignness in narrow terms as well. So we'd want to think about what counts as an assimilated person. And language is often positioned as one of the clearest signs of whether someone is assimilated, and there's the pernicious assumption that this population is unwilling to learn the English language, even though the Hispanic population in the United States is undergoing language shift from Spanish to English as fast as, if not faster than, any migrant group in US history. And so regardless of that as an empirical fact, there's still the assumption of an unwillingness to learn the English language. And it's that contradiction between what we might think of as empiricism and what people are doing. So you can know that people, or you can read that people are learning English and still perceive them as not using English. And that's part of what's most interesting to me about these kinds of dynamics. But they're articulated in relation to a range of debates about what do we label this population? Is it a racial category? Is it an ethnic category? And you have assertions that it's ethnic and it's not racial, that you can be any sort of phenotypically appear in any way. These questions about whether this is a minority population, of what sort, and then just a lot of people are sick of the conversation altogether. But what's interesting to me about the assertion that Hispanic or Latina, Latino, Latinx as a gender non-binary alternative, that it's an ethnicity, not a race, I understand why people are invested in asserting this about this category, particularly because there's the reality that Hispanic people present in all different ways phenotypically, particularly in terms of skin color. However, I worry about the notion that it's presenting in phenotypically distinctive ways that makes Hispanic an ethnicity, not a race, because it seems to assume that blackness presents in a phenotypically homogeneous way, or that whiteness presents in a phenotypically homogeneous way. And so I worry about the flattening out of a range of racial categories that occurs in order to assert that this category is not a race. Often you see these invocations of the rising demographic of a Latinx population. So even as recently as the last couple of days in relation to the Democratic primaries, there are invocations of the Latino vote as a sleeping giant, this kind of thing, and this idea of a demographic rise. I should note that these invocations of a sleeping giant, they have taken place for the last 60 years or so. So there's like this Rumpelstiltskin. So there's a lot of, this question of who's always sleeping. But often you see this notion that the United States, or that this is a population that's of future significance in the United States, and we won't be able to think about the US without making sense of this population. There are claims that this population, which currently is about 70 million people, that it will be half of the US population by the end of this century. You have often ideas about language that figure centrally in these demographic prognostications, the question of whether English is the language of this population in the future, or whether Spanish is the language of this population in the future. This is my favorite one, though. It just says US will be biggest Spanish-speaking country by 2050. It says scholar, so you can just sort of say whatever you want. We don't need any specificity here. So part of what's interesting about these invocations of language, Latinx or Hispanic identity, and the future is that they are often articulated in seemingly positive ways, or seemingly welcoming ways, or hopeful, optimistic ways. But I worry about populations continually being positioned as a people of the future, because what does that mean for your contemporary claims to rights and resources if you haven't yet arrived? And so there's this way in which people have been here for the better part of a century, or more than a century in some cases, since essentially the inception of the United States, and yet are always framed as not yet here. And so I want to think about these invocations of the future. These debates about language and the assertion that language learning is central to the experience of this population. They are also articulated in a range of ways that can be somewhat surprising depending on the context. So in some cases you have advocacy for learning English, as Tom Brokaw was suggesting. In other situations you have advocacy for learning Spanish, but in interesting ways. So this is the principal of a predominantly white Brooklyn charter school who was giving a tour to parents of prospective students a few years ago. It's an elite charter school, and she tells these parents, if you don't speak Spanish, you're going to clean your own house. And so here she's promoting Spanish language learning in this sort of strange way in relation to an assumption about maintaining one's class superiority, one's socioeconomic superiority. And there's this idea that you need to become bilingual to maintain your class status. And so I worry about the ways that we articulate or we promote bilingualism, often reproduce these sorts of class stereotypes. We can also see that kind of problem in this sort of advertisement, which on the left promotes Spanish language learning materials, and on the right promotes English language learning materials. So on the right it says, no habla inglés, necesita este libro, you don't speak English, you need this book. On the left you have a man who's positioned as, or represented here as lighter skinned. He is dressed more formally, and he's the one who needs to learn Spanish. On the right, a darker skinned man dressed less formally, and he needs to learn English. So these stereotypes here about race, gender, class, and language get intertwined, but what's most interesting to me about this is these advertisements on each side are both promoting bilingualism, but bilingualism in service of reproducing a class hierarchy. And so I want us to be really careful about how we champion bilingualism, and if it's divorced from a critique of these class hierarchies or efforts to address class inequality, then bilingualism on itself doesn't necessarily pave the way towards a more egalitarian future. And we see this in terms of histories of the stigmatization of bilingualism and bilingual education in the United States. So in California, for example, Proposition 227, around the turn of the 21st century, outlawed bilingual education for an entire generation of students. And the silver lining in the 2016 election, from some perspectives in California, was that Proposition 227, which outlawed bilingual ed, and I should say similar propositions were enacted around the same time in Arizona and Massachusetts as well. But this was overturned in 2016, so that now bilingual education is no longer banned in California. But what's so fascinating to me about Proposition 58, which overturns 227, is the name of this proposition. California Non-English Languages Allowed in Public Education Act. What a sad vision for multilingualism, this idea that languages other than English can simply exist in schools. Now, to be clear, languages other than English have always existed in California schools, and 2016 just says, I guess that's okay. What kind of a vision for a comprehensive multilingual education during the entirety of one's learning experiences is articulated here? And this is part of my concern. And what we find often is that the kids who were stigmatized through Proposition 227, through the banning of bilingual education, are also stigmatized, ironically, through Proposition 58, because now that you have dual language schools implemented throughout the United States, you see what some have described as the gentrification of dual language schools, where they have gone from the basement to the boutique. And now they're framed as elite educational opportunities. And again, the very same kids who were marginalized in one moment are marginalized, racially marginalized kids, their stigmatization ends up being reproduced in deceptive ways. And often kids from Latinx backgrounds are framed as lacking legitimate Spanish and lacking legitimate English in these classrooms. So they're lacking the academic variety, the so-called academic variety of the English and Spanish languages, which leads cities, school districts, entire districts like Los Angeles to classify thousands of students as non-nons. And these are mostly Mexican origin students. In Los Angeles Unified, the LA Times reported that 6,800 children were classified as non-nons and said to be nonverbal in both English and their native language. To be clear, virtually no human child is a non-non, and yet this doesn't stop mainstream institutions such as schools from designating them as such and then relegating them to an inferior educational status where they aren't able to access opportunities, learning opportunities at grade level. So this non-non ends up reproducing these ideas that your Spanish isn't good enough and your English isn't good enough. Just to give you a sense of what constitutes someone as a non-non in practice, this is a screening tool that is used to designate or used to assess whether Mexican American children in Los Angeles Unified have mastered so-called standard English. So on the left you have standard English examples. In the middle column you have alleged possible Mexican American responses, and then you have the idea of what's wrong with those Mexican American responses. So if you look at number 1, don't be bad, if a Mexican American child sees that phrase, they might read it out loud allegedly as don't be bad, and the problem with that is sing-song or circumflex intonation, which essentially means that Mexican kids sound like they're singing when they speak, and that's a problem. Their intonation needs to be flattened out. So again, to be clear, intonation and prosodic effects occur in every human language. It just so happens that when Mexican American children are engaging in these practices, they're framed as a problem that needs to be addressed, and that can position someone as incapable of engaging in or producing mainstream or so-called standard English. Perhaps even more egregious, you might look at number 16, the apple, which a Mexican American child might allegedly pronounce as the apple. And you should all know that pronunciation of the should be the before a word that starts with a vowel. So you're not supposed to say the apple, you should say the apple. Again, I'm a Ph.D. linguistic anthropologist. This was news to me. And the question is why these sorts of stereotypes, these are conclusions about populations that are in search of evidence. So it's essentially, we know that something's wrong with your language, and we'll just sort of map anything onto it in many cases. So this idea, many people, millions of people would say the and aren't stigmatized for it. So why is this happening? And what you see is that thousands and thousands of children are designated as long-term English learners. These are kids who have been designated as English language learners. That means that they don't pass the reclassification assessment for more than 6 years. So these might be kids for whom English is the primary language that they use. This might be kids for whom English is the only language that they feel comfortable using, and yet they still are not legitimate users of language. They're framed as long-term English learners. What's so interesting about that reclassification assessment is that many kids who are not Hispanic and who identify as monolingual English users, they also can't pass that reclassification assessment. So again, if English is the only language you use and you can't pass that reassessment, then what's going on in these situations? And these kinds of classifications end up stigmatizing people systematically across contexts. So part of what I'm interested in here is how these presumed deficiencies are a reflection of what I've described with my colleague Nelson Flores as raciolinguistic ideologies. That is, presumed deficiency such that regardless of the extent to which your practices might seem to correspond to standard, they can still be perceived as a problem, as wrong, as incorrect, as foreign, as unintelligible. So let me just give you one example of a raciolinguistic ideology that's perhaps lower stakes because it's in the context of a celebrity media moment. So this is a recent Emmy Awards broadcast where the actresses Eva Longoria and America Ferrera have this to say.
Yes, hi, I'm Eva Longoria, not Ava Mendes.
And hi, I'm America Ferrera, not China Rodriguez.
Yes. And neither one of us are Rosario Dawson.
No. Well said, Selma.
Thank you, Charo.
So they're invoking the idea that all Latinas are interchangeable with one another, that there's no distinction to be drawn. After they engage in this sort of playful banter, MTV Australia says, where are the English subtitles? Have no idea what Eva Longoria and America Ferrera are saying. And so what's interesting about this to me, and this is MTV Australia then apologizes and said this is a poorly framed joke, but I'm interested in the logic that informs the joke. The idea that particular populations, regardless of their language practices, which I think from many mainstream perspectives are perceived as unremarkable English language use or unmarked English language use, could be framed as unintelligible somehow or in need of subtitling. So it's that sort of attribution of deficiency or foreignness and that I'm interested in terms of this notion of raciolinguistic ideologies. So I've analyzed that in my book. This is sort of shameless plug for the book that came out last year, which is an ethnography, so a community-based study of a Chicago public high school and its surrounding communities. And this high school is more than 95% Mexican and Puerto Rican, and I'm interested in the ways that these ideas about language profoundly shape the students' experiences within the school, particularly the ways that boundaries between languages, boundaries between ethno-racial identities, and boundaries between citizenship statuses are constructed in relation to one another. So geopolitical, ethno-racial, and linguistic borders naturalize in relation to one another. So ideas about foreignness, legitimacy, and then racialized ideas as well. Part of what was interesting to me about entering this school in Chicago, again, more than 95% Mexican and Puerto Rican, is that when I first met with the principal of the high school, a Puerto Rican woman, she said to me, look, you know, I'm going to give it to you straight. When people look at my students, they see them as stereotypes. They see them as gangbangers or gang members, criminalized, or they see them as hoes. They see them as sexually deviant and promiscuous. I want them to be seen as young Latino professionals. And I was really struck by this claim, or by this statement by the principal, I thought, about race, class, gender, and sexuality intertwined. I wanted to know what a young Latino professional looks like and sounds like. And I wondered about the ways that the problem was framed as living within the students themselves. So is it the students who need to change to become a young Latino professional, or do we need to transform societal stereotypes through which these students are viewed? Because she said, I want them to be seen as young Latino professionals. But part of what was so striking about this is that her notion of Latinidad or Latino-ness stood in stark contrast to the students' ideas or assertions of their identities as first and foremost Mexican and Puerto Rican. So these are images of celebrations of Mexican and Puerto Rican identities that are on display throughout the entire school year, but really at the most strongly at the beginning and the end of each school year when you celebrate Mexican independence in September and the Puerto Rican parade in June. So you go into the school year celebrating Mexicanness and leave celebrating Puerto Ricanness. These are images of Mexican parade during Mexican independence in Chicago and of the Puerto Rican parade as well. This is a grad school me in the Puerto Rican parade in Chicago when I was conducting this research. So part of what's interesting about these ideas about Latinidad is that people are trying to make sense of where Mexicanness and Puerto Ricanness fit into this pan-ethnic category of Hispanic or Latino, and how does this articulate in relation to, say, whiteness and blackness as well, and a range of categories, Asianness, indigeneity. So in some situations, the students draw very clear distinctions between Mexicanness and Puerto Ricanness. In other situations, they laminate these identities. So in Chicago, for example, there's often a chant that you'll hear, Boricua y Mexicano luchando mano a mano, so Puerto Rican and Mexican fighting hand in hand, which is a reflection or an assertion of a shared kind of a sense of solidarity that has emerged in Chicago over the last 70 years or so as Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have migrated to the city and built their lives in close proximity to one another, often experiencing shared forms of spatial, racial, and class exclusion. And so part of what's interesting, and you see images here on the top left is a pro-immigration reform rally, which juxtaposes the Mexican and Puerto Rican flags. In the top middle is artwork on a classroom wall, students' now defunct social media pages, MySpace pages and that kind of thing. And then the bottom is a church, interestingly, which is located in a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood, or the heart of Puerto Rican Chicago, called Paseo Boricua, or Puerto Rican Promenade. It's a Mexican church, and it's a Mexican church in a Puerto Rican community where undocumented woman Elvira Arellano took sanctuary for more than a year, and the 2007 Puerto Rican parade was dedicated to an undocumented Mexican woman. This would be unthinkable anywhere else in the United States, this idea of Mexican and Puerto Rican solidarity articulated in this particular way. And yet in Chicago, that's often for many people just what the terrain is. And so Mexicanness and Puerto Ricanness are sometimes separated from one another. In other cases, they are forged together and asserted as a racialized category. So sometimes separated and sometimes combined. But the students, these ethnic and racial boundaries are often asserted in relation to national borders in interesting ways. So the students aren't just invested in their Mexicanness in general, but their Chicago-based Mexicanness. So you can't see the lights are a little bit bright, but you might see this is a sneaker that one student has. It's a Nike Air Force One shoe with the Mexican flag, and right in this part of the shoe is the Chicago skyline. So the idea isn't just saying I'm Mexican, but I'm Mexican from Chicago. Similarly, this is a tattoo one student had of the Mexican flag, the state of Illinois, a map of the state of Illinois, and it says Little Village, which is a predominantly Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. So in this case, Illinois is claimed as a state of Mexico, and then you invoke a neighborhood in Chicago in relation to Mexicanness and Illinois identity. Puerto Rican students are deeply invested in these Chicago-based monuments to the Puerto Rican flag. These are the largest monuments to any flag in the world, and many people say, what's going on with Puerto Ricans and flags? You're a little obsessed. But you have to remember the U.S. colonial government outlawed public display of the Puerto Rican flag from 1898 until 1952. And so the display of this flag for many people is a sign of profound pride, and for some is a sign of anti-colonial pride. This flag is not just any Puerto Rican flag. It's dedicated to the waves of migration that came to Chicago to build the city of Chicago and the forms of labor in which they participated. So the flags are made out of steel, they're welded, and they're piped because those are the primary industries in which Puerto Ricans participated as they created the city of Chicago. So the students are deeply invested in the Chicago-based flag. Here you see that flag that bounds, again, a strip of streets, those streets known as Paseo Boricua. You see the Chicago skyline. It says City of Wind, which is great. So this is a Spanish-dominant tattoo artist, we'll say put Spanish-dominant in quotation marks, who translates Chicago's moniker, the Windy City, into Spanish, which would be Ciudad de Viento, and then back into English as City of Wind. So it's beautiful Spanglish if you recognize it as such. And then at the bottom, you might not be able to see clearly, but it says, Yo soy de aquí, I'm from here. The question is whether here is Chicago, is here Puerto Rico, or is Puerto Rico in Chicago, and vice versa. And so for these students, these diasporic kinds of realities, where Puerto Rico and Mexico exist in Chicago and vice versa, that remapping of those borders is related to the remapping of the borders between Mexicanness and Puerto Ricanness and Americanness in many ways. Perhaps my favorite diasporic imagery is tied to the idea that you can't just be a Bulls fan in Chicago of a basketball team, you have to be a Mexican or a Puerto Rican Bulls fan. So deeply invested in these ideas. And in fact, there's a flag that's dedicated to that neighborhood, or this flag is dedicated to the neighborhood that is between the two giant Puerto Rican flags, and it's the Paseo Boricua flag. It invokes colonial imagery of Africanness, indigeneity, Europeanness, and it says Humboldt Park, which is that neighborhood in Chicago. You see the Chicago skyline and the steel flag. This flag is named 79th because there are 78 official municipalities on the island of Puerto Rico, and this neighborhood, Humboldt Park, has been adopted as the 79th municipality of Puerto Rico. So again, Puerto Rico exists in Chicago, Mexico exists in Chicago, as the students remap these borders. So they're remapping these ethno-racial and geopolitical borders in relation to linguistic borders as well. So let me show you how that works. Part of what's involved initially is establishing the borders between English and Spanish. So the students are deeply anxious about their ability to produce what's perceived as legitimate English or unaccented English. This is an interview with two young men who are Puerto Rican. They're both juniors in the high school, and I asked them one of my favorite questions, which is, do you have an accent?
You think you have an accent? No, I don't think so. Okay. I think I might though. Yeah. So it's like, cause I be playing video games on Xbox Live, and I just be talking like this, like, shut the fuck up, you Mexican. And I'm like, whoa! He came real hard at me. Why you say I'm Mexican? I'm just talking English. Yeah. And they come and say I'm Mexican out of nowhere. So you think you might? So I think I might, but I don't know.
So he's expressing an anxiety about his perceived language use. In this case, he refers to an internet-based video game where your virtual opponent can hear your voice but not see your face. And he's assuming that if he's just speaking English, why would he sound Mexican? But he's being confronted with the ways that he's racialized as Mexican and the ways that Mexicanness can be perceived through one's English language use. And so the positioning of Mexicanness as the default category of Latinidad or of Hispanic identity ropes him into this category, and then he tries to distance himself from that category in somewhat troublesome ways, but he's grappling with this idea that Mexicanness can be perceived through English language use. So in some cases, the students are trying to establish their English language use in ways that reflect anxieties about their ability to do so and their ability to speak so-called unaccented English. In other situations, they're establishing their investment in the Spanish language, but not just the Spanish language in general. So similar, they're not just invested in the English language in general, but so-called or stereotypical unaccented English. They're not just invested in the Spanish language in general, but Mexican and Puerto Rican Spanish. So this is an interview with a young woman who's a sophomore. She moved to Chicago from Mexico City when she was about 10 years old.
And where in the world would you go to hear the best Spanish?
The best Spanish?
Yeah.
I said that it was gonna be the Spain, but I heard that it's not. It's in Mexico City.
Okay.
That's what I heard.
You wouldn't go to Puerto Rico to hear good Spanish?
Nah.
Nah.
No, because they speak. They don't get the. They don't say the words right. They miss some words. Like they sometimes they lose the R, sometimes they lose the N, and it's like really weird.
Okay.
And with Mexicans, I would say Mexicans, they know how to talk. And
Okay, much less you think it's just Puerto Ricans who have stereotypes about Mexicans. It goes in both directions in different ways. So this young woman is asserting that Mexican Spanish is more correct than Puerto Rican Spanish. And we want to think about where those stereotypes about the correctness or the incorrectness of Puerto Rican Spanish come from. Ideas about the Caribbean, ideas about blackness especially, frame Puerto Rican Spanish as inferior. And we see often Caribbean varieties of language. And really, it's about blackness more broadly. Varieties of any language in relation to blackness are often stigmatized. I should note that the brackets signal overlapping speech, just so you can understand some of the diacritics here. But what's interesting to me too is she articulates this shifting set of language norms in the US and mainstream schools where Castilian Spanish or Peninsular Spanish used to be used as the normative variety that you would teach in foreign language classrooms in the United States, and Mexico City Standard has often been positioned as the norm in the last 30 years or so in the United States, and she's suggesting Mexico City is where you would go to hear the proper Spanish. So she's invested in this idea of Mexican Spanish and its correctness. Other students are invested in Puerto Rican Spanish. So this young man is Puerto Rican and Mexican. His birth mother is Mexican, his birth father is Puerto Rican, but he was raised largely by a Puerto Rican foster family. And again, note that the equal signs are interruptions and brackets are overlapping speech.
Do you think that Mexican Spanish or Puerto Rican Spanish is better?
Puerto Rican Spanish.
Why?
Because that's what's up, man.
Okay.
I mean,
What's smarter?
smarter, Puerto Rican Spanish.
Okay.
They're very smart.
Okay, let me ask you this.
Mexicans are smart too, but
What's more correct?
what's more correct? I think Mexican.
Okay.
Because they be like, como ustedes están. Or they'll try to say, como ustedes estás.
Just bear with
I
him.
think that.
Estás. But it don't sound right.
So can you do an impression of a Puerto Rican and a Mexican saying something?
And like, Mexican will be like, hola, como ustedes están. And Puerto Rican will be like, como ustedes están. Like that, you know?
Okay.
You know, so like that.
Okay.
But like, hands on down, man, like Puerto Rican got that shit in the back, though.
What shit in the back?
That language.
What's it mean to have it in the back?
They have it in the bag, though.
What's that mean?
Like, I think they can knock out any Spanish thing, bro.
What does that mean though?
Like all these other languages, Spanish or Brazilian, they know nothing on Puerto Rican.
What makes Puerto Rican Spanish better?
Because it sounds way better.
Okay.
Because like the way it flows.
Okay.
Listen to how he pronounces this word.
Like you can hear some of the reggaeton music, you can hear the way the guy flows.
Okay.
All right, so there's a lot going on here. He attempts to perform standardized Spanish, but he performs what is largely perceived as incorrect Spanish when he does an impression of Mexicans. And I should note that his presentation or his performance of impersonation of Mexicanness and Puerto Ricanness, they both sound like Puerto Ricans. So he says, "Como ustedes están?" When he's many other students impersonated Mexicans and Puerto Ricans much better, at least were to a much greater humorous effect for many audiences. But part of what's interesting to me here is that whereas the previous student, this young woman, suggests that Mexican Spanish is correct and Mexican Spanish is better because it's more correct, and Puerto Ricans Mexicans know how to talk. Puerto Ricans don't even know how to talk. And in fact, one student in Chicago in the schools asked me, can they have the news in Puerto Rico? And I said, yes, they have the news in Puerto Rico. And she said, they let people talk like that on TV? She couldn't imagine that there was standardized Puerto Rican Spanish. And so I showed her Puerto Rican news so that she could understand that there are lots of varieties of Puerto Rican Spanish, just like there are lots of varieties of Mexican Spanish, like she was familiar with. In contrast, this young man suggests that Puerto Rican Spanish is better because of the way it flows, and it sounds like reggaeton music, and he trills his R really hard on reggaeton, which will matter in a moment. So what you see here is a remapping of stereotypes about stereotypical white English and stereotypical black English. So stereotypical white English is often framed as correct and uncool. Stereotypical black English is often framed as cool and incorrect. You see those stereotypes mapped onto Mexican and Puerto Rican Spanish in this case. But to be clear, Mexican Spanish in the United States is not often stereotyped as correct. It's vis-a-vis Puerto Ricanness in the Chicago context. So this is a deeply local set of stereotypes and sensibilities. So the students are invested in signaling their ability to produce unaccented English or stereotypical unaccented English while also demonstrating their intimate knowledge of Spanish. So how do you speak Spanish in English without being heard as possessing an accent? So the students, they navigate these competing demands by engaging in practices I call inverted Spanglish. So to give you a sense of what that sounds like, this is that same young man you just heard, and you heard him trill his R hard on reggaeton. Listen to how he pronounces barreras.
And so, does your birth mom speak Spanish?
Yeah.
What kind of Spanish does she speak?
Regular Spanish. Like she just learned it from Inglés and Barreras and shit. You feel me? For real. Real talk.
How do you?
And
how is that regular Spanish?
To me, that's like a new breed thing right there.
Okay.
But my mom talks Spanish. Sounds like a Mexican.
Okay.
But my stepdad sounds like a Puerto Rican. We never talk.
Okay.
So you know he could trill his R on barreras because of how he produces reggaeton, but here he says barreras. Part of what's interesting to me about this is he invokes an English language learning platform. It's sort of outdated at this point, that's often advertised in Spanish language media. So he demonstrates his in-group knowledge of Spanish language media, but then also his ability to produce what's stereotypically perceived as unaccented English. So Inglés sin barreras is how you manage that demand. So that's what I call inverted Spanglish. But the students would do this in a range of ways. So one group of Mexican ninth grade students would play a joke on only their most beloved white teachers, and the teaching staff in the school was predominantly white. So it's a fraught kind of segregated context where they would act like they didn't know how to pronounce certain words, and they would say, "Teacher, I don't know how to pronounce this word or these words. Can you help me with this?" And the teacher would say, "Sure, no problem." And they would say, "It's pink cheese, green ghost, culeros." And the teacher was inadvertently saying pinches gringos culeros from the perspective of the students, so which means fucking American assholes from the perspective of the students. And the students would then laugh and let the teacher in on the joke, and they would laugh together and then often engage in impromptu language learning practices. And so this is a deeply segregated context where the students are grappling with their position in relation to their teachers, and this was a way of creating intimacy, even though it might seem confrontational. So it's an interesting context. But for the students, what looks just like the English language isn't just the English language. Spanish lives in English and English lives in Spanish from these students' perspectives, the way that Mexico and Puerto Rico live in Chicago, and the way that Mexicanness and Puerto Ricanness live inside one another in many ways. So this reworking of borders is part of what's so profound to me about what happens in this context, where people are creating lived experiences that defy some of the boundaries that we often map onto them. In my last couple of minutes, I just want to kind of talk about what I see as the concrete implications of these insights about language and borders. So this is another volume that came out last year, Language and Social Justice in Practice, which I co-edited alongside fellow members of the Language and Social Justice Committee of the American Anthropological Association. And part of what we've tried to do is to cultivate a vision of or advocacy, linguistic advocacy, that isn't just about advocating for language learning as an end in itself, but language learning in relation to community transformation and really broader societal transformation. So let me just show you one project in which I've participated that is a reflection of this. This is a picture of a neighborhood in western Massachusetts called Holyoke, Massachusetts. It has the highest concentration of Puerto Ricans anywhere outside of the island of Puerto Rico, at least as of a few years ago. These numbers have shifted after the hurricane. So at one point, Holyoke was about 50% Puerto Ricans, and I lived there for 4 years when I taught at UMass Amherst. It's one of the most Puerto Rican, I'm Puerto Rican, and it's one of the most Puerto Rican places I've ever been, Holyoke, Massachusetts. Now, Holyoke's high concentration of Puerto Ricans is often stereotypically associated with high rates of educational underachievement. So Holyoke here is the school district with the highest percentage of students scoring below proficient in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So Puerto Ricanness and educational underachievement are often stereotyped in relation to one another, and then language is frequently presented as an explanation for why Puerto Rican students aren't doing well in Holyoke schools. So you see here, Holyoke again was among the lowest in the state despite a high school graduation rate that improved slightly to 53.8% from the previous year's 52.8%. The city of 40,000 is roughly half Hispanic. Among challenges, officials have said, is that English is not the first language for more than 70% of public school students. So here the problems facing Holyoke community members are reduced to language, a so-called language barrier, rather than a shifting economy that hasn't provided for a living wage or stable jobs, limited access to healthcare opportunities, limited access to political or electoral representation, hyper-incarceration of this community. So all of these structural barriers, unstable housing, aren't framed as the challenge that needs to be addressed, but rather just learn English. And the idea is that if you would learn English, the structure of the economy would transform, and jobs and homes and opportunities would rain down. That simply hasn't been the case for millions of people in the monolingual English users, and yet still face profound experiences of exclusion across institutional contexts. So we really want to rethink these ideas about language as the solution. But these stigmatizing views of the Spanish language are received within Holyoke loudly and clearly. As one poet in the community put it, this city is allergic to Spanish. But it turns out the city is not allergic to Spanish, because the young, queer, charismatic, white mayor of Holyoke, Alex Morse, is bilingual in English and Spanish and ran a bilingual mayoral campaign successfully and became the youngest mayor of Holyoke in its history. And his bilingualism, his Spanish language use, is framed as a wonderful skill, a wonderful resource, whereas for Puerto Rican students within Holyoke schools, it's framed as a crisis or a problem to overcome. The question is, why is that the case? So in order to investigate these issues, I partnered with my students at UMass Amherst and students at Holyoke High School, and I worked with a Spanish teacher at Holyoke High School to train the students as linguistic ethnographers to address what was going on in this community. So we conducted oral history interviews with families, we studied vernacular language use in the community and slang, we tracked language use across a range of platforms, social media platforms. We looked at language as it was etched across the community in its landscape. We tracked language policies like the anti-bilingual education ordinance in Massachusetts, and we tracked where people were voting for and against that policy. And then students conducted ethnographies of communication in barbershops, in churches, and throughout this community. I'll just show you two examples and then wrap up. The oral history interviews were really fascinating. Almost all of them came back asymmetrically bilingual, which means that the student was speaking English and the parent was speaking Spanish. So this is an interview with one particularly boisterous, brace yourself, freshman, Darian, and this is what he has to say to his mother, or with his mother.
What's your primary language?
Mi lenguaje primario es inglés, pero
Can you elaborate on that?
es que yo hablo inglés porque en la escuela yo hablo inglés.
Oh, when you were
Con mi
younger.
amigo yo hablo sí, y con mi amigo yo hablo inglés, pero con mi familia yo hablo en español.
That's good, Mom.
What I love about this example is him performing ethnographer for, can you elaborate on that? And then he wants to wrap it up immediately. That's good. That becomes a high school freshman again. Let's move this along. But what's so interesting here is he asks her in English, what's your primary language? She responds in Spanish, and tells him that her primary language is English. And then he asks her about that, and she goes on to explain to him that she uses Spanish with family and English in other contexts. But you might anticipate that if someone asks you what your primary language is in the language that you identify as your primary language, that you would then respond to them in that language. And yet she explains that based on their cultural norms, that's just not how they do things in their household and in their family. Now, in many mainstream institutional contexts throughout Holyoke, this kind of seeming contradiction is framed as a crisis or a problem, as part of what's called as an alleged pathological culture, as one city council member put it, rather than as a perfectly normative practice that occurs all over the world. And so the question is, what would it look like if Holyoke institutions were designed in ways that responded to this reality? The students who were tracking the linguistic landscape, they found that functional information in the school, like these welcome signs, were often bilingual in English and Spanish. They found that privileged information, like information about taking the SATs or applying to college, was exclusively in English, like this information. And they found that punitive information, like these no loitering signs that stood in front of the school, was exclusively in Spanish. And in highly non-standardized Spanish, morphosyntactically and orthographically. It says no hangueo, which essentially means no hanging out. And it plays off of the slang verb hanguear. And so the goal wasn't just to document these linguistic inequalities or these forms of linguistic stigmatization, but rather to respond to them. So we created a Proyecto Palante, a Puerto Rican culture and history group within the school. We partnered with the superintendent of Holyoke schools and created a Latinx advisory committee to create an ethnic studies program in the school to train K through 12 teachers and train the students to respond to their realities. And the idea is, again, to have those signs taken down. So the students took the signs down, and that was a victorious moment on some level, but not as an end in itself, rather as the beginning towards rethinking how education could function in this space to support and sustain people's life ways. And this is part of a broader set of initiatives I've been working on in Chicago and elsewhere that we're calling Community as a Campus, to understand the ways that these neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods often, and racially marginalized and segregated neighborhoods, are often framed as spaces from which to escape rather than as intellectual sites. And so they're often positioned as petri dishes or experiment sites by scholars and others, rather than as sites where people are creating analyses and theories and understandings of their everyday realities and responding to them powerfully. And so the goal is to think with them in order to, again, create institutions that respond to people's everyday lives. So in conclusion, part of what I want to think about is the way that these ideas about language and belonging always need to be pushing the boundaries and the borders of our theories of change. So the goal can't simply be, say, to challenge the language of immigration, which many of us have been working on, or to assert citizenship in a range of situations. So we've challenged the Language and Social Justice Committee of the Society for Linguistic Anthropology has challenged the use of the term illegal in reference to migrant populations. And in fact, the Associated Press has removed that term from its style guide. But that's not an end in itself. We have to transform our ideas about migration as a fundamental human right. Similarly, we have to transform our ideas about U.S. citizenship, not just asserting access to citizenship or a pathway to citizenship, but rather seeking to transform what citizenship is altogether. And part of the effort here is thinking with broader political movements and struggles that have sought to point out, like Black Lives Matter and other movements that have said, wait, you can be positioned as a citizen and yet still relegated to second, third, and fourth class citizenship. So simply advocating for immigration reform doesn't solve these endemic problems or address these endemic issues. We need to transform what citizenship is altogether. We also have to be very careful about our discourses of the United States as a nation of immigrants and simply promoting immigration reform narrowly, much less we ignore various indigenous movements that have said, wait a second, this is not a nation of immigrants in any straightforward way. This is a settler colony that was built on top of populations and histories that were already here. So if you look at the anti-Dakota Access Pipeline movement and other efforts towards decolonization, the nature of the problem is reframed altogether. So if education around language and if linguistic advocacy more broadly is rooted in not simply accumulating developing language skills, but reimagining what a decolonized world might look like. I'm interested in sort of engaging in that kind of project with these communities and with you all as well. So thank you very much.